Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me today to discuss what I believe is one of the most critical and misunderstood conflicts of our time. Before we dive into the headlines about drone barrages and warnings from Putin's inner circle, I want you to ask yourself a question that might make you uncomfortable. What if everything you've been told about this conflict is incomplete? What if the real story isn't about good versus evil, but about economic systems in collision? Now, the mainstream media wants you to focus on the latest drone attack, the latest warning from Moscow, the latest escalation. And yes, these are serious matters. Russia has indeed unleashed new waves of drone attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, and Putin's advisors are making increasingly stark warnings to the United States and NATO. But here's what they won't tell you on CNN or Fox News. This conflict didn't begin in February 2022, and it certainly isn't happening in a vacuum. This is about the decline of American economic hegemony, the desperation of a capitalist system in crisis, and the refusal of Washington's foreign policy establishment to accept that the world is changing. Let me be clear from the outset, I am not justifying Russian military action. Civilians are dying, cities are being destroyed, and that is a tragedy regardless of which economic system you prefer. But as an economist who has studied the rise and fall of empires for decades, I can tell you that what we're witnessing in Ukraine is fundamentally an economic war dressed up in the language of democracy and sovereignty. The United States has spent over $100 billion supporting Ukraine in this conflict. $100 billion. Do you know what we could have done with that money here at home? We could have housed every homeless person in America. We could have provided free health care to millions. We could have rebuilt our crumbling infrastructure. But instead, that money is being funneled into a proxy war that serves the interests of the military, industrial complex, and the geopolitical ambitions of American empire. Here's the hook that should grab your attention. Russia's new drone barrages aren't just military tactics, they're economic statements. They're targeting energy infrastructure, which tells you everything you need to know about the real nature of this conflict. This is about control of resources, control of markets, and control of the future economic architecture of Europe. When Putin's inner circle warns America, they're not just talking about nuclear weapons or military escalation. They're warning about the end of dollar dominance. They're warning about a multipolar world that Washington cannot accept because American capitalism depends on global hegemony to survive. Think about this for a moment. The United States has built its post-World War Roman II prosperity on a simple formula: control the global reserve currency, maintain military bases in over 150 countries, and ensure that critical resources like oil are traded in dollars. This system, sometimes called the Petrodollar system, has allowed America to export its inflation, fund its massive debt, and maintain a standard of living that its actual productive economy no longer supports. Russia, China, and much of the global South are now challenging this arrangement. They're creating alternative payment systems, trading in their own currencies, and building economic alliances that bypass Western financial institutions. Ukraine, tragically, has become the battleground where this transition is being fought with real bullets and real blood. Now let's talk about those warnings from Putin's inner circle. Dmitry Medvedev, Sergei Lavrov, and other Russian officials have been remarkably explicit about their red lines. They've warned that continued NATO expansion, continued weapons shipments to Ukraine, and continued use of Western long-range missiles against Russian territory could lead to catastrophic escalation. Are these threats? Yes. Are they credible? Absolutely. But here's what's missing from the American discourse. We never ask why Russia feels threatened in the first place. Imagine if Russia had military alliances with Mexico and Canada, and was placing missile systems along our borders. How would Washington react? We know exactly how they would react because we've seen it before during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The economic dimension of this conflict cannot be overstated. Since the West imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, we were told the Russian economy would collapse within months. The ruble would become rubble, Putin would be overthrown, and Russia would come crawling back to the Western dominated global order. But what actually happened? The ruble recovered. Russia found new markets for its energy exports. China, India, and much of the developing world refused to join the sanctions regime. Meanwhile, Europe plunged into an energy crisis. Deindustrialization accelerated, and ordinary Europeans are paying the price through skyrocketing energy bills and declining living standards. Who benefited? American liquefied natural gas companies, who are now selling gas to Europe at premium prices. This is what I mean by economic warfare. Here's another hook for you. Every drone that Russia launches, every missile that strikes Ukrainian infrastructure, is paid for by European consumers who are still buying Russian energy through intermediaries. The sanctions regime is full of holes because capitalism cannot function without Russian resources. The hypocrisy is staggering. We claim to be fighting for Ukrainian freedom while German factories shut down from lack of affordable energy. We claim to be defending democracy while refusing to acknowledge that NATO expansion was explicitly warned against by American statesmen like George Kennan and former diplomats who understood that you cannot keep poking the Russian bear without consequences. Let me address the humanitarian crisis directly, because I know some of you are thinking, Professor Wolff, what about the Ukrainian people who are suffering? You're absolutely right to ask that question. The Ukrainian people are suffering enormously, and they deserve our sympathy and support. But the best way to support them is not to prolong this war with endless weapons shipments. The best way to support them is to push for a negotiated settlement that acknowledges the legitimate security concerns of all parties involved. Instead, we have leaders in Washington and Brussels who seem willing to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian. That's not solidarity, that's cynicism. The drone barrages we're seeing now are a symptom of a war that has settled into a grinding stalemate. Neither side can achieve total victory, yet neither side is willing to negotiate seriously because the political costs are too high. Meanwhile, the economic costs keep mounting. Global food prices have surged because Ukrainian grain exports have been disrupted. Energy markets remain volatile. The risk of nuclear escalation, whether intentional or accidental, grows with each passing month. And for what? So that Ukraine can become a member of NATO, an alliance that was created to fight the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. Let me offer you a different framework for understanding this conflict. This is not a battle between democracy and authoritarianism, no matter what the State Department tells you. Both the United States and Russia are capitalist countries with their own forms of oligarchy and corruption. This is a battle between a declining unipolar hegemon and a rising multipolar world order. The United States cannot maintain its global empire in the face of Chinese economic growth, Russian resource wealth, and the general desire of the global South to escape from neo-colonial economic relationships. Ukraine is tragically caught in the middle of this historic transition. What would a rational policy look like? First, we need to acknowledge that Russia has legitimate security interests, just as America would in a similar situation. Second, we need to stop pretending that unlimited military support for Ukraine will somehow lead to Russian defeat and regime change in Moscow. That's fantasy thinking that could lead us into World War III. Third, we need to redirect the enormous resources being spent on this conflict toward the real crises facing humanity: climate change, inequality, healthcare, and the crisis of capitalism itself. Fourth, we need a negotiated settlement that includes Ukrainian neutrality, security guarantees for all parties, and a serious diplomatic framework for preventing future conflicts. But here's the reality. None of this will happen as long as American foreign policy is controlled by the same establishment that has given us decades of failed wars and military interventions. The people making decisions about Ukraine are the same people who told us that invading Iraq would bring democracy to the Middle East, that intervention in Libya would promote stability, that arming rebels in Syria would lead to a better outcome. They've been wrong every single time, yet they remain in power, making the same mistakes over and over again because the system rewards them for it. So when Putin's inner circle warns America, when Russia unleashes new drone barrages, when the conflict escalates yet again, remember this. You're not watching a simple story of aggression and defense. You're watching the death throes of an empire that cannot accept its own decline. You're watching capitalism in crisis, lashing out because it cannot solve the fundamental contradictions that are tearing it apart. You're watching ordinary people in Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and yes, even America, pay the price for decisions made by elites who will never face the consequences of their actions. Here's my final hook before I close. The greatest threat to your well-being doesn't come from Russian drones or Chinese economic competition. It comes from a system that values profit over people, that spends trillions on war, while claiming we can't afford healthcare, education, and a decent life for working people. The conflict in Ukraine is a symptom of that system in crisis. Until we address the underlying economic structures that drive these conflicts, we will continue to lurch from crisis to crisis, from war to war, until we either build something better or destroy ourselves completely. In closing, I want to leave you with a challenge. Don't just accept the narratives you're given by politicians and mainstream media. Ask deeper questions. Who benefits from this conflict? Who pays the price? What kind of world are we building with these choices? And most importantly, what kind of economic system do we want for the future? Because that's ultimately what this is about. We can continue with capitalism's endless competition for markets and resources, which will inevitably lead to more wars and more suffering. Or we can imagine and fight for something different, an economic system based on cooperation, sustainability, and human needs rather than private profit. The warnings from Putin's inner circle, the drone barrages over Ukraine, the escalating rhetoric on all sides, these are not inevitable. They're the result of choices made by human beings operating within a specific economic and political system. We can make different choices. We must make different choices if we hope to survive the 21st century. The question is whether we have the courage and the vision to do so before it's too late. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope this has given you a different lens through which to understand the headlines you see every day. Stay critical, stay informed, and never stop questioning the official narrative. That's how we build a better world, one conversation at a time.